Hey everybody, how are you? Good to see you. Thanks for being here. Thank you for joining us tonight. And hello to those joining us online. It's nice to see you back in person, see your faces. Yeah. We're welcoming poet Roger Reeves this evening to Washington State University Visiting Writers Series. And good timing too. Roger, not just today, Roger was named a finalist in poetry for the National Book Award. So let's give him some love. Our events this semester are made possible by many hearts and minds. A partnership between WSU Pullman and Vancouver English departments, WSU's College of Arts and Sciences Land Escapes, Native American programs, WSU's Vancouver's Council on Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, the Jordan Schnitzer Museum of Art, AOI, and WSU's Common Reading Program. Washington State University Pullman is located on the homelands of the Nimiipuu and the traditional homelands of the Paleut Band of indigenous people. We acknowledge their presence here since time immemorial, recognize their continuing connection to the land, to the water, and to their ancestors. We view the land acknowledgement as a first but necessary step in our work to serve and honor our community and land grant mission. The Visiting Writers Series is committed to honoring this acknowledgement by bringing to campus diverse groups of writers working at the top of their fields, whose work, voices, identities, stories, and perspectives enrich the discussion in our community, the minds and lives of our students, and the university as a whole. In a few short weeks, on Tuesday, October 25th, we will welcome poet and multimedia artist Sam Rojas Chua to the Jordan Schnitzer Museum of Art. Put that on your calendars. We'd love to see you. It starts at 5 p.m. and will also be live streamed. I met Roger during the first year of my graduate study at University of Idaho. He gave a reading at Book People, which for me and probably at least several others that were there, that are in this room right now, was a transformative experience. A reading which captured an intense intimacy, one of particular elegiac joy. It both elevated the lives of the poems themselves and the responsibility to those poems on the part of the audience. The work of our Visiting Writer Series is often in conversation with our current common reading book. This year's selection is Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer, who we'll welcome in January. Reeves's work gives voice to the heart's heritage, to its liminal spaces, to its lineage and resilience, familial and literary, to the way people love and survive, and as Reeves states, quote, deploys ecstasy as a protest aesthetic, as a disruption of racial terror. His newest collection, Best Barbarian, poet Tracy K. Smith suggests, quote, conjures the losses, no, the thefts, at the root of the American story. Best Barbarian is a revelation and a form of reparation. Roger Reeves is the author of Best Barbarian, Norton, and King Me, Copper Canyon, a Library Journal Best Poetry Book of the Year, winner of the Larry Levis Reading Prize, the Penn Oakland Josephine Miles Literary Award, and a John C. Zacharias First Book Award. His poems have appeared in journals such as Poetry, Plowshares, American Poetry Review, Tin House, among others. He was awarded a 2013 NEA, a Ruth Lilly Fellowship by the Poetry Foundation in 2008, a Hodder Fellowship from Princeton, a Radcliffe Fellowship from Harvard, 2 Breadloaf Scholarships, an Alberta H. Walker Scholarship from the Provincetown Fine Arts Work Center, and a Whiting Award. He is Associate Professor of English and Creative Writing at the University of Texas at Austin. Please join me in welcoming to WSU Roger Reeves.
Grendel, all lions must lean into something other than a roar. James Baldwin, for instance, singing Precious Lord. His voice as weary as water broken over his scalp, and a storefront sanctified church's baptismal pool all those years ago when he wanted to be somebody's child and on fire in that being. Lord, I want to be somebody's child. And chosen, water spilling over their scalp, water taking the shape of their longing, a deer diving into evening traffic, and the furrow drawn in the air over the hood of the car, power, and wanting to be something alive and open. Lord, I want to be alive and open. A glimpse of power, the shuffle of a mother's hand over a sleeping child's forehead, as if clearing the city's rust from its face, which we mostly are, a halo of rust, a glimpse of power. James Baldwin leaning into the word light, his voice jostling that single grain in his throat as if he might drop it or already has. I'm calling to that grain of light, to that gap between his teeth, where the many of us fatherless sleep and bear and be whatever darkness or leaping thing we can be. In James Baldwin's mouth, my difficult beauty, my weak and worn, my future as any number of angels, which is not unlike the beast Grendel, coming out of the wild heaven into the hills and halls of the meat house at the harpist's call, with absolute prophecy in his breast and a desire for mercy, for a friend, an end to drifting in loneliness. And in that coming down out of the hills, out of the trees for once, bringing humans the best vision of themselves, which of course must be slaughtered. I want to thank Cameron for bringing me out. I do remember meeting Cameron all those years ago. It was I think that was my first visit to this area. I was out at Moscow. I've been out to Moscow twice. This is my first time staying in Pullman. For some reason, I had always imagined Pullman as like 20 minutes away, very far. It was like hill and dale. And it's like, no, it's really just right down the road. I like coming out here because it kind of reminds me of the South in a lot of ways, just not the landscape, but the sort of largeness of the landscape. It's also beautiful and dry. And when I was living in Chicago, the cold here was a better cold to come to. I was like, oh, I can deal with this cold. So it's great to be back here and seeing so many folks that I've seen before that have loved on me and I've loved on them. I want to thank the Visiting Writers Series and Washington State University community for having me. It's great to be here. I'm just going to read a few poems for y'all tonight, I think, and then we'll do a Q&A. What I try to do as I'm doing a reading from this book, giving readings from this book, which is a little different from my last book, I kind of read like the same poems over and over from the last book. And with this one, I'm always trying to read a poem that I've never read before. Partly because, like, if you put in the work of putting all these poems in a book, you should probably read them. You know, it just seems fair to the poems, fair to yourself. And so this next poem I've never read before. So I've never read aloud. I've read it to myself many times, as we do in making poems. It's called As a Child of North America, and it has an epigraph from Genesis 22 and 13. And Abraham lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, behind him a ram caught in a thicket by his horns. And Abraham went and took the ram and offered him up for a burnt offering in the stead of his son. As a child of North America. I wept for the ram and was told not to. His life in the thicket, horn held and groped by thorn and God, stone table and knife, his life crazed for sure, a free animal until mastery, and the Lord grants his vision, capture, the ram's flesh, chattering, smoke covering the face of God. I was told to celebrate this vision. The tambourine knocked and fluttering against the heel of my mother's hand drove the smoke higher, and higher the church climbed to witness the smoke, the ram, a burning angel burning in the eye of God. And God, wild as the eye of a goat, watching its body walk out from beneath it, in prophecy, in flame. How does it feel to be a problem, my mother once asked, from behind a knife in the first 10 years of a century, whose last 10 years will resemble a goat, hemmed in thorns, awaiting a knife, the new century to die in. How does it feel to be a problem? I answer upon a stone table, conscripted by tambourine and its talons drawing me higher, higher, until I am what vision forgets, something thrashing, a second sun of blood coming out of the day's slow thighs, mismanaged mercy so silent. I would remind you, I did not coo into the knife. I did not coo, though I wept like a goat and was glad. During the pandemic, I had this little ritual that me and my daughter would do, which was to read poems, right? Like she was 4, there was no daycare, it was just me and a feral child, and you know, with feral child energy, which is good. You know, our children should be feral. And we began like just reading poems, lots of poems every day, over and over and over and over to each other, and it was really kind of fun. And we wound up, as we were doing that, she would then begin to say to me, "Hey, Daddy, can I write a poem with my mouth?" And I'd be like, "Yeah, write a poem with your mouth, girl." And so she would like recite these poems, and she would have the most amazing syntax. And so that was a really beautiful moment, right? Of the pandemic was actually like teaching my child poetry and teaching her like what a sonnet is and what couplets are and like all these things, such that now when she goes to school and the teacher asks her, does she know what a poem is? She's always like, yes, I know what a poem is. And the teachers are like, are you sure? And she's like, and she once said to the teacher, do you know what a poem is? And the teacher was like, you know what? I might not know what a poem is. Let me chill out. But one of the other sort of things that happened during the pandemic was the summer of 2020. And Naima and I, that's my daughter, her name's Naima, you know, her mother and I were trying to figure out how to like talk to her about it, right? How to talk to her about, you know, racism and, you know, police violence. Because, you know, I don't believe a black child has room for that type of innocence in America. Right, that child has to go out into the world and be. So, and we were also you know, she's been to lots of protests, but these protests were a little different. So we were trying to figure out, should we take a 4-year-old, you know, out to the protest? And of course we did, because that's what you do if you want to raise a child that is committed to action. And so one of the things, though, that became really wild was one day, the city had painted in various places Black Lives Matter in the road. And then there was because Austin is a live music capital of Texas, or of the world, allegedly. I'm sorry. If you let Austin tell it's of the world, don't believe that. But they painted in one of the roads on the east side of Austin, which is historically the black neighborhoods and Hispanic neighborhoods in Austin. They painted in one of the main thoroughfares, Black Austin Musicians Matter. And we were out there playing, right, jumping on the letters because they shut the road down. And she heard the police were bouncing over the hills. You could hear the sirens coming. And she was like, "Daddy, are they coming to kill us, to kill someone?" And I remember thinking, how do I answer this? Because I don't want to lie. And so I said, I hope not. But every time after that summer she's heard sirens, this is the question she always answers. And this is the poem I sort of wrote thinking about this question of, what do the sirens mean for a young black child? Rat among the pines. Terror tonight is the moon slipping from a rat's gray grasp, finding its way back into the sky, which is America, a white moon leaning on the night's neck with its hands in its pocket. Moon hung calm above catastrophe, the police breaking the neck of a man who had just brushed summer's first beat of rain from his eye lashes, who, knocking a Newport against a wrist, watching smoke break its head against a brick wall, is preparing to die, unaware they are preparing to die. Heavy the moon, silly the tasking of a rat with delaying death. Terror tonight is the candor of the earth, where someone is preparing to die, and the earth receives that dying with its hands in its pockets. And the moon that once burnt the silk hump of a rat back in the sky. And my daughter hiding in the rose bushes, asking who the sirens have come to kill. And someone calling it beautiful, summer, moon, and someone dying beneath that beauty, which is America. Into the West. It would seem clear that no one can call upon thee without knowing thee. Though Augustine writes of God here, notorious for his absence, he could also be speaking of desire, pleasure, the tick of snow against the dry leaves, which sends my daughter spinning on her heel, the sound of it, that, daddy, that. Sometimes the world, its loitering joy is just a that. An absence that calls, demonstrates its over-there-ness, its being, but without a proper name. So a silence sounded, as when I enter the clearing I once begged for. You, at an instant, absolute and looking back at me, as if witnessing a calendar or road you've already passed through. So my face now, in whatever wolf, vulture, or golden horn of pleasure, a ticking of snow against the wet road, nameless, thee, where you've been and left the body of that being. So I hurry and press into your leaving, like a leaf scuttling after the dream of itself, into the sharp wet of snow against the skin, on into the West, where desire and sometimes pleasure is a type of faith, what you call me to in this spilling, this motion of night, your hair loose in the water of your back. Your spine has become the eye you wish for me to see through, but I must close my two good eyes, which is the beginning of any apocalypse or rapture, our daughter or the day, us touching the north and south of each other without compass or rose, this stumbling a type of faith too, a seeing, but without the dependence on sight or some heavenly ruin as signal of an end. It was like the deer outside, gathering at the window, licking the cold glass to smoke. How y'all doing out there? Y'all all right? Y'all are real quiet. Y'all must have grew up Catholic. I'm like, man, y'all didn't grow up in the Protestant church. No, I'm just playing. Just messing with y'all. Yeah, I like if y'all can make noise. I like noise. Feel free to do whatever you feel like doing. This next poem has a little bit of a background. Again, as I said, I was reading poems to Naima all the time, every day, and she would, as she would say, write poems with her mouth, and she. One thing about a 4-year-old is they're just learning what syntax is. So they don't really have a great understanding of syntax, which is like perfect for being a good poet. right? Because their sense of invention is they're actually really just listening to rhythm, right? And so what they're just trying to do is match the rhythm. So they'll put anything in the rhythm because poems are, right, like units of sound. They're not units of meaning in that sense. They're not like a paragraph. They're going to mean through sound, right? And so she would just have these wild, she would just come up with all these wild ways of like expressing things that I was like, yo, that's really amazing. Like I would just be like, you came up with that? And so I was working on this poem and I was just like trying to figure out where it was going. And we were talking about poetry that day, and sometimes we'd read multiple poems, and we just talk for more than like, I would always just try to, give her a little lesson of 20 minutes, right? She's 4. Sometimes it would go longer than that. And in this poem that she recited, that she wrote with her mouth, she said the last line of this poem. And I was like, oh my God. I was like, Naima, can I use that in a poem? She was like, yes, but every time you read it, you have to tell people that that's my line. I was like, I definitely will. I'm not a plagiarist, right? Like, I'm always gonna like respect, your writing. So the last line of this poem is Naima's. The title of the poem is Journey to Sanchindananda, which is it's a poem that's sort of after Alice Coltrane and her album Journey to Sanchindananda. Alice Coltrane figures really largely into this book. I'm a huge Alice Coltrane fan. Everybody knows John Coltrane, but Alice Coltrane was just as brilliant of an artist and just a brilliant piano player and harpist, just an amazing improviser. Pharoah Sanders just passed, and Pharoah Sanders played in several of the iterations of her records on Impulse in the late 70s, or early 70s, excuse me, after John Coltrane's death. That's all you kind of need to know. Journey to Sanchindananda. Alice Coltrane, her harp fills in the cracks of me with gold. The Japanese call it kintsugi. Where the vessel broken, only gold will permit its healing, its history. It's how the stars understand us. Lemon flowers on the skin of the earth. Mosquito filled with the blood that sirens its fat, long life. Who isn't dying to leave this house? To go masked only in the shadow of one's animal breathing. Lonesome, unprotected, knowing nothing lives as foreignness or death. That the black dog with a sword in his mouth, passing from house to house, will not bring its itch, its ticks and locks clogging our lungs. A permanent quarantine. Nothing that a little gold melted to ichor and spilled into the veins won't seem. Everything is a blue divergence on a harp. The red bells and the purple crepe myrtle this morning, forgetting that soon they will be the corpses the spring tree kneels to observe. No, they remember, as everything dying remembers its mother's name. Say your mother's name, not for power, but for the glimpse of power, to be more than a hesitation. Gold filling in the cracks. A window thrown open for no other reason than to continue a blue feeling. Nothing needed other than this devotion to darkness. A fire gotten brighter. My daughter holding my small name in her mouth. Light broken. Beloved. My daughter, a window thrown open. Her voice, gold filling in the cracked basketball court of me, announcing all nature will be dead for life soon. Yeah, she really said that. All nature will be dead. I was like, she was 4. I was like she would just have some lines, you'd be like, I have to step back now and make sure. Like, you'd be like, how old are you, 203? You're not 4, you're just like, that's an old ass child I got. But she was just like, this is why I love poetry, because what she was just doing was obeying rhythm. She heard a rhythm and she was just like, let me fill this in. And she was really interested it's really wild, like she was really interested in ambiguity. right? And irony. And I was like, like she just had a like natural sense for it. And I was like, this is really strange. Like, I remember I would record her and like people didn't believe me, right? Like, so I was like recording her and I would send it to some of my friends they were like, yo, that's really a poem. And I was like, I know, like I live with this. Like, so it was great to have her during the pandemic because it was kind of like, like I always say this about this book, which is that my daughter, along with Alice Coltrane, were kind of like my mentors for the book. I was really learning how to, like I would watch, and I'm serious about this, I would watch her make things at like 2, 3, 4, and 5, and she would just make lines, and she would make gestures, and she never corrected them. They were always the right gesture to her, right? And I thought, oh, what if I write poems like this, where I don't sort of censor the motion of the poem. I just follow the motion. Whatever the motion is, I follow it, right? And that was really helpful, particularly during the pandemic when you're feeling like, I can't make sense of things, I might die tomorrow because I don't really understand what's happening in the world, right? It was really beautiful just to follow the motion of language, right? Yeah, man. It's interesting having kids, man. Not saying that you should have them. It's not a heteronormative, like, you must have kids in order to be, no, just do you, I was reluctant at first. I was like, oh man, I can't believe this is what we gonna do. This next poem comes from an image from this painter. He's kind of an obscure painter in Texas. You guys have heard of Hermes, right? The Hermes, the scarves. Well, the designer of most of those scarves is like this older black man who's a postal worker in Waco, Texas. And he was he was one of the first black painters to have like a gallery show in Houston in the late 70s. And he was just an amazing painter, but he didn't like the art world, right? So he was just like, he liked to paint his paintings, but he needed a job. He didn't want to have a gallery, so he just like became like a postman, and he paints at night. And so he had this one painting that I've loved, where there's a cat sitting on the backside of a bull. So it's a great image, but it's not me. So I have to give, like I said, I'm not a plagiarist. You gotta give credit. This is called After the Funeral. A white cat has come to sit on the backside of slaughter, to sit on a white bull bearing a necklace of pomegranates. The cat has come not as any witness to a crucifixion or a coronation, not as angel or symbol of some comfort creature, some benign break in the dying, but as human wish, as distraction from suffering. My human wish to keep my father's schizophrenia in his casket, to keep that below the earth, one from another, now and forever, in season and out, from mountain to mountain, in the trees and after. Amen. Everything has come back to prayer, sitting in that delay, harrowing the fixities. My father in me, in my clock, my hoof, my feather, in the sprawling armature and stars of I am. Lord, am I worthy? Have I devotion? What body built of flood, of cancer, of winter, of woman? Lord, I pray as I've been taught to keep nothing from my tongue, its palm, its golden mind, so it bees and bees with whatever it bees. Rose, rain, Lord, even in her who rises from this bed, the naked two-ness of her filling the room such that she becomes the room. Lord, am I ready? How shall I bear the coming madness if it is to come? What disaster will I deliver to my daughter? My human wish, distraction, a white cat balanced on the backside of a bull, slaughter, far off. This delay, Lord, this delay I offer, because I own neither houses nor land, have not 100 heads of cattle or of state grazing on grain in a golden green field. Keep this coming distant, this sickness underground. And if, Lord, if I am to bear madness, become the father who scratches the raw earth with his hoof and snout, plowing the field as ox or ass, because the mind says, go, go into the pasture, not as ox or as ass, but go ox, go ass. Then, Lord, let me into the field, but make, Lord, diviner of the snowflake and master of fragments, a light, a golden light in a tree, and there have my daughter stare at its working, the darkness and the green, and the leaves and red blooms, while I behind her lick the tines of a fence, and leap in the dust in front of a white cat that has become my master, that I follow out to a white bull bearing a necklace of pomegranates. Let's see, I was supposed to read for about 25 minutes. I'm at 26. Can I read just one more poem, or do y'all want me to stop? Okay. I don't know, because y'all, like in the black church I grew up in, people be like, go ahead, brother. It'll be, this is the poem. I read this poem because this is the poem for many. Like, I had a book that came out in like 2013, and then people expected, like, in the poetry world now, people expect books to come out every 2 years, but that's not how like art happens. But that's how content creation happens, right? I'm not a content creator, I'm a poet. And it took me a long while to be okay with like not having a book, like not having anything, just be like, all right. And this was the poem where I was like, I think I might have something. Like I can tell when I write a poem and it's the beginning of something else. And this poem I had written, it was like the first poem I had written after my father's death that wasn't about him. For like the first year and a half, every poem, I'd start a poem about like a frog, and it'd be like, oh, and there's my dad showing up in the poem, right? Like, it was just like, he died, and he was just like, everything was like, I would be like trying to start way off. I'd be like, I'm gonna start with like a microphone stand, and it'd just be like, and then there's my dad, and he becomes the microphone stand. It was just really that sort of thing. And so this was the first poem that was like, okay, you might be able to write a poem. Like, for a while, I was like, well, I guess I'm just gonna write about my dad for the rest of my life. And I was like, that's not good. Being that he didn't really raise me, right? Like, but it just became this thing. So this last poem is called Children Listen. It turns out, however, I was deeply mistaken about the end of the world. The body in flames will not be the body in flames, but just a house fire ignored. The black sails of that solitary burning boat rubbing along the legs of lovers flung into a Roman sky by a carousel, the lovers too sick in their love to notice a man drenched in fire on a porch, or a child aflame mistaken for a dog, mistaken for a child, running to tell of a bomb that did not knock before it entered in Gaza with its glad tidings of abundant joy. In Kazmirez, a god is weeping in a window, one golden hand raised above his head as if he slipped on the slick rag of the future. Our human kindnesses, unremarkable as the flies rubbing their legs together while standing on a slice of cantaloupe. Children, you were never meant to be human. You must be the grass. You must grow wildly over the graves. Thank you. Yeah.
If you have some, I think what I might do, Roger's okay to put this right in.
Of course. Yeah. Yeah. And I'm gonna move around out from under, like, once we get out of the sermon portion of the program, it's time to go collect the offering. No, because churches are expensive.
Hi, can I
Hey.
do two?
Sure.
Is that okay?
Yeah.
Okay, so since you talked about a little bit how long it took you to compose so many poems and about content creation, do you know around how long it took you to compose all of the ones in that book that you read from?
Yeah, well, let's say I turned in the first book in 2011 or so, right? So you're just then copy editing the first book. So this book theoretically took to write between 2011 and 2021.
Wow, that's awesome.
I also will say that I wrote, I would argue that I wrote 2 other books before I wrote this one too.
My follow-up question. So I know there's a book signing after this.
Yes.
Are they selling them there as well?
The 2 other books that I wrote?
Any of them?
Oh, yeah, no, those other books are remaining in my hard drive. But I think they will be selling
okay,
these
cool.
books. Yes. I
Thank
think
you very
they will be
much.
selling. That's awesome. No, those other books don't. No. Other questions? Don't be shy. Everybody can receive the Lord. No, I'm just playing.
Hi, I was wondering if over those 10 years you noticed a change in your diction after entering fatherhood, and you think that that really changed how you wrote and both what you said and how you got to where you were.
Definitely. I was really I'll be honest with you. I was one of them poets that was like, nah, fatherhood's not going to change me. You know, like, I'm still be same poet, right? And I was like, nah. Like, it's not true. It is, as the insurance companies call it, it is a life event. Therefore, it changes one's life, right? Like, I understand now where they're like, oh, you had a life event. I was like, nah, I just want to add my kid to my insurance. They're like, no, this is a life. And I was like, oh, it really did. And I'll never forget. So I had this other book that I thought was going to be a second book. It might be a third book. Well, it won't be a third book because I got a book of essays. It might be the third book of poems. And I was working on it, and I was like, I got to get this done before I have my daughter, because if I don't, I had this sneaky feeling that I was like, this is not gonna be the thing I'll be. And after I had her, I didn't personally have her. You know, I was there in the hospital, right? I had the insurance, I had the formula and the food, and I was doing everything else, but I didn't physically. That was Monica did that. But I remember she was born July 13th, and I remember going to a Kamasi Washington concert. It was the first time that I had went out after having her, and it was September. And my partner was like, no, go ahead, go out. And I remember going to this Kamasi Washington. He's amazing jazz saxophonist out of LA. He played, he's the saxophone you hear on Kendrick Lamar's To Pimp a Butterfly, that's Kamasi Washington. Amazing player. And I remember going to this concert and being like, okay, that's the sound. There's something big and beautiful, and I was like, okay. And I came back to the house, I remember, and I was like, oh, I'm gonna write tonight. And I was starting to write, and I was like, no. I was like, I'm different. And I was really frustrated. I was like, oh, I can't write into that space anymore. And it took me a few months of trying to write into that space. And then I remember thinking, I have to write other poems. I just have to write differently. And it was just watching a child, for me, watching just Naima be herself. She just was just as a baby, she was just herself. She was fully herself. She was fully formed, right? And she was just wild, and I was like, oh, she is just wildly herself. And it's something I like to cultivate in her. She's a bit feral. Even now, if you came to my house, you'd be like, yo, why is your child not wearing clothes? You know what I mean? Or why is she just flipping all over the place? And I was watching it, and I was like, oh, that's what I'm supposed to be as a writer, right? I'm supposed to be like her. And so it really changed everything, and it really made me sort of move into language differently. And so I had to jettison lots of stuff. But yeah, it completely changed.
Thank you.
Thanks, man. It's a life event. Others. And I read a lot of poems about Naima tonight, partly because I miss her, but also one of the things I think is really important is that fathers write about their children. We are used to hearing mothers, like Sylvia Plath, one of our most famous mothers, right? other poets, and we don't really think of, like, fathers, we don't really hear about fathers writing about their children. And so that was kind of the risk of the book in certain ways. Like, I was like, oh, I'm writing like a domestic book, right? Like, this is a domestic book, right? But we don't normally think of particularly black men in the space of domesticity. And I was like, oh, what would that be aesthetically for me? So just a little, like, sort of way I was thinking that finish answering the question. Because, like, all of a sudden I was like, domestic, you know?
Roger, thank you for coming to read for us. Appreciate it. I'm just wondering, are there any words that you're like afraid to write? Like, well, you mentioned every poem became about your father.
Yeah.
I can kind of relate to something like that, so I don't ever like to write like mom or dad or anything. Those are words that I don't like to write about. So are there any words like that you try to avoid in your writing just because it's not what you want to write about or anything?
I actually think wherever I try to avoid is exactly where I have to go to as a writer. So the words I have to avoid are the ones I like too much, right? Like, those are my darlings, right? Like, yeah, and those are my obsession. Those are the words that trigger certain ways of thinking. But no, I don't think so. I generally am actually interested in the thing that most scares me sometimes, or the thing for which I say, like, if I'm writing, for instance, and I'm like, oh, I can't say that. I'm like, ooh, maybe I need to say that. Maybe that is exactly, or I can't say it that way. I'm like, as soon as you tell yourself you can't say it, you're like, oh, that's where something is happening, right? So I would say to you, sir, maybe that is the place to go, right? And because this is the other thing to remember, Louise Glick has this really great essay in a little book of kind of craft essays called Proofs and Theories, and she talks about how writing about maybe a past traumatic event isn't the same thing particularly when we're making art of it, right? It becomes something else, right? Like, this is the thing about a poem, right? We can lie in poetry, right? This isn't the narrative nonfiction class, right? No, we're not James Fry, and like no one's like, oh, we're buying this book based on its veracity, right? So there's a way in which sometimes actually taking a traumatic event or taking an event and changing it, right? Fictionalizing actually will help you sort of think about how to think about the event as something that's like in the space of something like artifice. Does that make sense? And I just think art might be a good way to deal with what we don't want to touch. So.
All right, thank you very much. Appreciate it.
No problem. Levi, what's good with you, man?
So when you're creating a poem, is there like a process you take? Like, what inspiration do you use? Because deciding what poem to do, because there's so many different types, do you just like create a bunch of words and see, okay, can I create something or maybe a specific poem with this? So I just kind of want to know what your thought process and your writing process is like.
Man, I always say I think it's all of the above, right? There are times when I've used word banks, right? Particularly if I'm trying to write something like a sestina, right? Or there are times when, remember yesterday where I gave you all the assignment where I first started you writing a certain type of poem and then I gave you something else to think about and I wanted to see how that would change what you were writing about? I do that. I'm listening. I'm listening to hear. Sometimes I just sit out and listen to people talk, right? I follow snatches of sound. I was just at the museum in Austin, right? And there was a painting called The Death of Rachel, right? And I was like, and Rachel's the name of my sister. For some reason that like stuck with me, right? I think that's gonna appear sometime somewhere, right? Either the painting or this idea of the death of a sister, right? So I think that it's like, I always say I'm from the Malcolm X school of poetics by any means necessary, right? Whatever is there, I'm going to do, right? Like Mike McGriff, like this cat McGriff over here, he'll sometimes say things to me, he'll be like, what about this? What about, right? Like, it's friends, it's all over. I have another friend, Reeves, she was like, hey, I want you to write a poem that has this stanza structure. Boom, right? Like, whatever, because the thing is, the formal pressure helps me find something that I wouldn't find without it, right? But I think the thing is to see so many possibilities for a poem, and that there isn't sort of a monolithic poem one is after.
It's not a monolithic sound. Hopefully you're changing. Like I always bring up Stevie Wonder. Like album to album, Stevie Wonder sounds so different, right? He's like, he had the like electronic phase. Then he was like, oh, I'm gonna do like a reggae phase, right? Like Stevie Wonder was like, oh, I'm gonna do this funk thing, right? I think about late Stevie Wonder, I'm gonna do these ballads, right? So I just think that that's kind of the type of artist and writer I wanna be, where I'm kind of sounding different album to album, right? And I'm thinking about that as a poem, right? I always think of myself as a fox versus a mole, right? If there's two types of writers, right? A friend of mine, Soul, she's always like, are you a fox or are you a mole? A mole is someone like Wallace Stevens. They're gonna write the same poem over and over, but they're gonna dig deeper into the same sort of meditational moment, whereas a fox is leaping over fences like, oh, I wanna see what this yard is like. Oh, next time I'll be a formal poet. Oh, this time I'll be over here, right? Like, I think of myself as a fox, right? I'm leaping from poem to poem. I want that sort of change. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So I would say, ask your friends for assignments. Be like, give me a poetry assignment. Tell me to write some type of poem, right? Just because that type of stuff is actually really generative and useful. Because right now, you're just trying to write lots of poems, man. You just want to write as many poems as you can. I told y'all, like yesterday, I like wrote poems and like burned the notebooks. I was writing so many poems. I'd be like, I don't need this notebook, and I would just burn it after. You know, that's the way you want to be writing poems now.
Awesome. I was also going to ask, well, once you finalize a poem and say you kind of have everything you want, when does the revision process end for you? Because I know that's something difficult to understand, like kind of just
that's
see,
a great question.
am I done here?
I can give you two answers. I'll give you the like woo answer, and then I'll give you like the more like, oh, in a classroom sort of answer. The woo answer is to me when it becomes silent. When I'm reading the poem and it just feels like there's silence all around the poem in me. Like the only thing is the words. And I can hear it, like it's just like, I call it the buzz of the universe. When the poem is sort of like tapping into like the buzz of the universe. And for some reason, it's a space of like, almost like peace and stillness. That's when I'm like, oh, this poem is done. The more academic, sort of practical is when everything feels inevitable to me. When one line leads into the next, and it just feels like everything is snapping into place, and it just tumbles, and it feels like it's of its own, it's on its own. It doesn't need me to like emphasize anything in any particular way. It's just sort of sonically together and tight. That's when I know. But it takes a while. It takes a while sometimes. Like for instance, if I don't quite have the title, like for this book of poems, titles weren't coming to me. And that was because the poems weren't done when I thought they were done. And as soon as they like got to a stage down, I was like, oh, here's the title, right? In a way that like in my first book, titles came really easily. So, does that help answer?
Yeah.
Okay, good questions. Revision is difficult, I'll tell you. It's like beauty.
Beautiful reading, by the way.
Thanks,
But I have a question about your writing process, because you tackle so many sort of hard topics that I feel like one missed word and someone's just going to jump on you, right? Like a critic or something.
Sure.
Do you like to write out sort of your thoughts on something and then sort of generate a poem, or do you just sort of jump into the poem and let your emotions take over?
That's a great question. I don't believe in knowing where a poem is going. So that's I really want to be surprised as the poem is moving. Like I told y'all last night, no surprise for the writer, no surprise for the reader. Frost's great words, no tears for the writer, no tears for the reader. I really believe that. And so what I'm interested in doing is following the poem. There used to be this poet that just died named Dean Young, and he said this thing that was really important to me when I was in grad school. He said, don't intend anything for the poem, attend to the poem. And I think there's a difference between attention and intention. And so what I would offer is we should just always be attending to the language. We should be attending to what the poem seems to be opening up to, opening out towards. And in terms of like the politics of critics, one of the things is I'm gonna get stuff wrong. I'm human. I'm gonna get stuff wrong. I can always be like, oh, I got that wrong. Or we disagree on something, right? I think we're in this age, when I mean age, we're in the current moment where being wrong is, I think there's a type of morality attached to wrongness. And I think artists must take the risk of being wrong. I know it's controversial, but I actually think like that's how we learn is from bad art or art that's not successful, right? Because most art isn't successful. Someone could have, I could find problems with a lot of things that people find very successful, right? So I would say if a critic comes to me and be like, you did X, Y, and Z, I could be like, oh, okay. If the argument is valid, okay. You know, like I have a book of essays coming out. I know that this one is going, like in poetry, people don't always know what you're talking about, so they'd be like, well, okay. But essays, people think they know what you're talking about, right? Because it's in a paragraph, and people think they know what paragraphs are. They think they understand logic, right? So they'd be like, oh, that's, you know, I'm saying some wild stuff. So, you know, I'm like, you know, I say wild stuff though in general. So, like, if anybody knows me knows that I say real wild stuff just like every day. My mom's always shaking her head at me, so. My mom thinks sometimes she's just like, I can't believe you said that. So I think we just have to allow ourselves to take the risk, and I don't mean just like be like profligate or try to harm people, right? I'm thinking about like risking critiquing the country, right? There's certain types of critiques I have of America that I know people are gonna. There's certain types of critiques I have of Black people, right? I know people are gonna be like, oh shit, right?
Thank you.
No problem.
You often find a deep meaningfulness and like sentimental thing within poetry. Do you ever have any sentimental attachments to poetry, especially since you talked about your father and your daughter?
Sentiment. I do have. I am full of emotions, but I don't know about attach. Like I think poems are like. I'll be honest with you. I don't know if it's a sentimental attachment, but I do kind of believe Wallace Stevens when he says poetry is the supreme fiction. Right. I do think that like all art, like all written art, like everything comes out of the poem. Right. The first scientific treatises were line broken in verse. Right. So I think that like poetry is the supreme fiction. Like I do think poets are like the bomb, right? I do think we are the gods of, we don't get paid like gods, we get paid like snails, but we are the gods. So does that make sense? Like
Yeah.
like for me, the emotional landscape of a poem is very important, to be honest with you. I think that like, I'm gonna risk the emotional landscape, right? More than risking a type of like standoffishness, right? So.
Thank you.
No problem.
Here, should we take a few questions from the online?
Yeah. I'm looking for them. Like, oh, is it a
I will
screen?
deliver them.
Okay.
First question, how does radical poetry change hearts and mind? And will poetry be able to change the world, in your opinion?
I always think about, I use this line, I wrote a poem, I've written an essay about this. There's a poem by Adrienne Rich called Dreamwood, and she says, poetry isn't revolution, but a way of knowing why it must come. I think that poetry is a way of sort of, poems announce the future and future possibilities. They announce what's untenable about the present, right? They sort of, and I think that can commit people to action. But the poem itself isn't revolution, right? But it is a way of knowing why it must come, and I think that's important, right? So in terms of political, and I also think that poems don't have to be about that at all. Like poems can just be about like a snail on a leaf. Sometimes we need that too, right? We need all of the things because we're actually here for beauty, right? We're here to make beautiful lives. And I think sometimes beautiful lives are very political lives, right? But I think beautiful lives can also be like rest, right? Could be just sitting by a body of water, right? I think all of that is necessary. So will it change the world? I think if we let poets be gods, then yeah. But if we treat them like snails and puppy dog tails, no.
A couple more from online.
Sure.
All right.
Yeah.
Did writing about your father lead to your own personal epiphanies about fatherhood?
It did. My father, as I mentioned in the poem, was schizophrenic and refused to take medicine his whole life. So it was just kind of untenable to live with him. And so my mother left, and which was the best decision. Sometimes it's actually good not to have a father in the house, particularly if that father is not going to be caring in the way that a child might need it. But yeah, I learned a lot about what I thought about fatherhood by writing about it. Because like when you're a new father, you don't know anything. I'm just like, I just want to make sure this child is like alive, right? Your first goal is like keeping them alive. Like, I want you to eat. I want to make sure you're pooping regularly. You're not wet. You're sleeping. You're not losing any weight, right? Like, and once I learned that, I was like, oh, there's only 3 things that I have to worry about. Oh, but those 3 things sort of just kind of morph as the child gets older, right? It'll be like, well, I don't have to make sure you eat anymore, but I do have to make sure you like don't jump off the roof of the house, right? Because you may think that that's a fun thing, and I could tell by the way you're looking at the roof of the house and like you're interested in getting on the roof and jumping off, right? So the things do shift. But yeah, writing about my father and his death, particularly because I found out my father was going to die on my first Father's Day. He had a very rare form of cancer, and I found out on that day that he only had 12 weeks to live. It was also this thing where my father wasn't there for me as a kid, but I was like, oh, he can be a grandfather. And then that was taken from me, and that was a big lesson. That was a huge lesson for me as a person, that one only has what one has. Like, I have this moment right now with y'all. That's it right now. That's what I got. Right? And so it really taught me how to be there with my daughter.
Thank you. Another one that just came in from the online chat. What advice do you give students about reading their own poems aloud, both in a class setting or an open mic, especially if they're reading publicly for the first time?
Oh, man. I think read aloud as much as possible. We have to remember this is an oral art form. Despite it being in a book for like thousands of years, no one had, but like, I always remind people, Sappho didn't write. And actually, writing didn't exist for like hundreds of years after her, right? So all of Sappho's fragments that we get were written like hundreds of years later, right? So this is an oral art form. When I think about the epics of Gilgamesh or any of the epics, right? They were all passed down orally. So this is an oral art form. And I think that there's a type of sensibility that comes to prioritizing sound and a way of sort of being in sound that's really beautiful. So I would say read aloud as much as possible and sort of allow the words to perform. I think too often we think, we have to do like this and like sometimes the words are actually giving you enough. It's just like, for me, I want to step out of the way of the words and just let the words do the work, right? So that would be my advice. Read as much as possible. And I would argue, and I do this all the time, read other people's poetry aloud. Get those rhythms in your body. If you love a poet, be like, oh, let me read this poem. Because the more and more you read that poem and that poet, you'll get those rhythms inside you. Right? It's like if you try to walk like Beyonce, eventually you will be able to walk like Beyonce. Maybe. Any other questions?
I've got maybe time for one more. Anybody? Oh.
Hello.
Hey.
I don't know how I quite wanted to phrase this question, but how has being, a Black man in this field, a Black poet, a Black writer, affected you, like in the negative ways, like racial discrimination? How has that kind of affected you as a writer? I don't know, in good ways and bad ways.
Man, I would love to write. Like, that's a really good question, partly because, and I was telling someone this, I think I was telling Cameron this, when I first decided to be a writer in like an undergrad, which is like 2000, if you go back and look at how many books were being published, Black books of poetry being published a year, it would sometimes be 0, sometimes be 1 or 2, right? Even up to like 2008, it was like 6. Right? So when I chose to be a writer, it was under the assumption I would never have a book because that was a different publishing America, right? So that formed, and I think in a really beautiful way, it formed my relationship to poetry, which was I wasn't doing it to be published. I was doing it because I loved it. Like I just loved the art. And I was gonna do whatever I could to like make the art, Like I remember going to my MFA, and I had a guy in my MFA. He's a good friend of mine. He's a white guy, and he was like, on the first day, he was like telling me about his plans after his MFA and how he was going to get published by so-and-so press, and I was like, wow. And I was like, oh, this is the difference between like a white poet and a black. Like a black poet would never be like, yeah, I'm gonna be, I'm thinking about sending my manuscript to FSG and Copper Canyon. And when my book got accepted, my first book got accepted by Copper Canyon, I was the first black writer with a first book on their press in close to 40 years. This is a preeminent poetry press. And the last poet that they published as a first book writer was Cyrus Cassels in 1983. I was 3 years old, right? When my book gets accepted, I was 31. It's 28 years, right? And so that's what the world looked like. So there was that, but what it also did, which was beautiful, is there became all these little poetry circles that nobody was paying attention to, called Cave Canem, Callu Creative Writing Workshops. You should check these out if you're interested in writing, right? No matter what. And they were nurturing black writers, right? So we were forming our own communities, and they were outside of the sort of establishment or the mainstream. But this is the thing. Toni Morrison said this really beautiful thing once, where she was asked by Charlie Rose in an interview about writing about white people and why she didn't write it. She was like, I wasn't interested in that. She said, I understood that if I wrote well about the people I love, the center would move out to where I was. I didn't have to move into the center. The center would move to where I am, right? And so that really was like black poetry world, right? Like I was telling Cameron about like some of the folks that I used to hang out with that like people are like, oh my God, you were hanging out with someone. I was like, yeah, because we all that's how we gave each other assignments. Right, we read each other's work. So for me, I think we think about this as like what race doesn't allow, right? But we have to remember, like I always tell people, that black people, there were more black kids in school when school was segregated. There were more black colleges, more kids in college, black kids in college than there are now when school is integrated. It's a weird sort of thing, but it makes sense, right? So there was a way in which sort of being ignored by the mainstream was actually really useful because it allowed us to make what the fuck we wanted to make. Now, there's also been terrible stuff. Like, I think in this book, I was freer than I was in my first book. Like, I write about growing up in a Pentecostal church. That was like, nobody was writing about like that type of stuff when I was, right, like in the early 2000s, even in the 2010s. I've had wild things said to me. I've had wild things. Right, but one thing that I remember, I had an elder that always reminded me that the thing that black people have always been is imperishable, right? And this is the truth about writing too. If we think about writing, there's more no's in writing than yeses. And I think black folks are particularly primed for no's, right? Our life is full of no's. So when like an editor says no, you just go, okay, keep it pimping. Right? Okay, no, okay, here's a yes. Right? So I would say that, I would say like, it's always, I think it's beautiful to be black. Right? Like I think it's absolutely wonderful.
I agree.
Right? and I think that sort of, how do I say this? We make beautiful things, even if it doesn't always hit the mainstream. But this is the truth of the matter. If we look at all American art forms, where do they start? Right? We wouldn't have an American art form if it wasn't for the Negro, right? So, yeah, I think it's a beautiful thing, I could tell you horror stories. Like, I had a death threat from a student who wanted to kill me because I said something about race, and he thought that race shouldn't be in a poem, so he writes a poem where he says, he kills me in the poem, right? That's stuff you got to deal with, or you have colleagues who will say things while you're doing admissions, for instance, like, people that write about race are what's ruining MFA programs. We can't let them in our MFA programs, right? And these are folks with endowed chairs, Pulitzer finalists, right? But you got to keep it moving. You be like, okay, as I would say, that's your dumb ass, right? So I would say that's been my experience. And so I would say to the writers of color in the room, to the women in the room, just keep writing.
Thank you so much.
Fuck
I
the
appreciate
haters,
it.
you know what I mean? All right, y'all.
Thank you so much.
Thank y'all for being here.